Well, hey there. You have stumbled into Sister Sharpens Sister, where three sisters get together each week and talk about first one thing and then another.
Welcome back for another episode of Sister Sharpens Sister. You will see Shalon and I sitting side by side. And Delina is over on another little box there. I don't know where on your screen, but she's on my left. We are continuing our discussion of food in America throughout history. And Delina's going to take us through the beginning of the 1900s up through and including, hopefully, if we get that far, World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right.
Okay, so start with the 1900s, the early 1900s. Now, we did cover that briefly a little bit in the last episode, but it was just a hit and miss.
It was. I'll go over again what we basically discussed last week on the early part of the 20th century, because it's the turn of the century. The American diet was very similar, if not exactly the same as it was in the 1800s. What Americans were eating were seasonal and regional.
Yes.
Nearly 40% of the U.S. population lived on farms in 1900, and 60% lived in rural areas. In comparison to today, and the website I used today for them was 2017, so that's a few years ago. So the numbers may not be exact, but it's not that far back in time. But compared to today, only about 1% of the population lives on farms, and about 20% live in rural areas.
That is just amazing to me, that the difference.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, Karen discussed about the trains and transporting of produce using trains, especially when they started using some of them to put ice in.
Yeah.
And doing all of that. And they were, of course, still doing that at the turn of the 20th century. So people were starting to get out of season foods like oranges from California and Florida, oysters from coastal areas to non-coastal areas. These were things that were
strawberries, things like that. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, horse-drawn deliveries of fresh produce, meats, milk, eggs, things like that, those were being used up into the 1920s. Okay. Now, that did improve the distance that could take place from field to table or farm to table, but it still took quite a bit of time because it's not an automobile. It's a horse-drawn carriage. So if you got one horse, you got one horsepower carriage. Right?
Right.
You got two horsepower carriage. So it did improve it some, but not significantly. And of course, areas that were around navigable waterways, they would use boats. And when steam came in for the steam engine, they would use steam engines for those boats. So the boats could be used along the coastal areas. And that helped quite a bit. And so although we did have automobiles at the time, because they were invented back in the late 1800s, they could not readily be used at this time because the roads in the United States were in such poor condition.
Yeah, they're so bad.
Now,
when did pavement start? Do we know that? When did pavement?
I didn't go into that detail. So I don't know, but I did read a little bit about it in some of the research. But I didn't really get into the detail. So so the road conditions were very poor, and autos were not that used that much, but I'm sure in the areas where the roads would allow it, they were probably being used.
It says here in the United States, the first recorded use of liquid asphalt was in 1870.
Okay.
And then widespread adoption of asphalt paving in America began to take shape in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Okay.
So by 2005, the Federal Highway Administration recorded that 2,601,490 miles of American roadways were paved with some variety of asphalt.
Wow.
Okay. And well, they were using it back in the late 1800s, I guess, and in the early 1900s. And Congress passed the Federal Aid Road Act of 1916, to where the federal government gave money to the states for the states to improve the roads within the states. This is not the interstate system. That doesn't take place until a little later.
Okay.
And what they designated $75 million in 1916, and today's value of $75 million. Let's say 79 or 75. It's 75 million.
75 million. Okay.
75 million. Today's value of 75 million is $2,233,587,378.64.
That's
So it's over $2 billion.
that number is
I know.
right.
Right. But if you think about it, if you're going to improve all of the roads within the states in the U.S., it's going to take a whole lot of money to do it.
Well, yeah, if you're going to do all of them, but in 1916, I'm sure that areas in southern West Virginia weren't paved.
Oh, no.
Areas that aren't paved.
Right?
Now, the road conditions, of course, didn't change overnight. It took time to make the improvements that would allow the fresh food deliveries by trucks or autos instead of horse-drawn carriages. And the research that I did, that I could find, it showed that it took from 1916 to 1939 to complete the state road improvements.
Wow.
So, yeah, so it took a long time to do. So now we're coming up to World War One. Okay, World War One started July 1914 and ended November 1918. The United States entered the war in April of 1917. Okay, and they stayed in until it ended in November 1918. So the U.S. was in the war for just a little over a year and a half. So we have food rationing that was initiated for the war effort. The railroad at this time was being controlled by the government for the war effort. So even though we were probably getting deliveries of food, a lot of that food was being rationed and sent to the troops overseas and to American allies.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, soon after the war started in 1917 for us, when we got involved in 1917, the government urged Americans to watch their food intake of food staples like wheat, beef, pork, butter, fat, and sugar. So those could be used to support the American troops and the American allies.
Mm-hmm.
Americans started using replacements for those staple foods such as oats, buckwheat, potatoes, rice, and cornmeal rather than using wheat. And they would rely on poultry and fish rather than beef or pork. And then they would be using honey and different types of syrups instead of sugar. Okay. Now I've got a war bread recipe that I will send the website link to Karen so she can share that.
Yeah.
So there's that. I also have a wheatless bread recipe where they use potatoes.
Okay.
So that somebody wants to take it and make it, they can. Now we have to talk about something else. We have to talk about refrigeration.
Okay.
Because refrigeration greatly changed the American diet, or the diet of anybody who can have refrigeration and have fresh produce delivered to them, or they can go buy it at a grocery store.
Right.
Okay. So refrigeration. In 1913, American Fred W. Wolf invented the first home electric refrigerator. We're talking about the electric refrigerator, not the icebox.
Right.
Which featured a refrigeration unit. Okay, hold on. Let me find mass production. Sorry, I got lost. Mass production of domestic refrigerators began in 1918 when William C. Durant introduced the first home refrigerator with a self-contained compressor. So they didn't really start and kick off and start being used until after World War One.
Right.
So it was in 1918 when that happened. Now, refrigeration will significantly change the American diet. It changes food variety. Refrigeration allows for a wider variety of foods to be available year-round, including fresh fruits and vegetables and proteins. And it will lead Americans to have a more nutritious meal and more options for that meal to all classes of people year-round.
As long as you could afford the refrigerator.
And the electricity, yes.
And the electricity.
Yeah. Food waste, it cuts down on food waste as long as you eat your food before it goes to waste, because it keeps it cool so you can have leftovers the night before from supper, and you can save it and eat it for lunch the next day if you want, instead of eating it for your breakfast.
Right, yeah.
Food transportation. Okay, it allows for longer distance transportation of perishable foods. It's also led for diets to be more, what the website called it that I went to called it more homogenized diet. And what they're talking about is being more equal.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not just people who live in Florida that can have fresh strawberries and oranges during the winter time. West Virginia can have it too.
Right.
Right. And when it's too hot in Florida in the summers for those fruits to grow, other states around our nation can provide those to Florida so they can have those during the very hot summer months.
Mm-hmm.
So now, and of course, talking about being homogenized, it's also talking about milk and the way they take the milk fat and they reduce it into really, really tiny, tiny particles. That way it distributes evenly throughout the milk so your cream and your milk don't separate.
Right.
It's a big drawn out process. I'm not going to get into all of that just yet. Mealtime options will change because refrigeration has made it possible to serve different foods together at the same time and in the same season. And the example that I have here is a cheeseburger with tomato, lettuce, and cheese.
Okay.
Because if you're in Maine in the winter, at the turn of the 20th century, you're not having lettuce and tomatoes unless you've dried them and are eating them like that or canned them. You're not putting them on a hamburger.
Right.
But now you are. Convenience foods, refrigeration led to a shift towards prepared, frozen, and convenience foods. So we're talking about refrigerated and frozen food cases at the supermarket. Pre-kept meats. So you no longer have to go to a butcher shop, or you don't go to a wet market to pick out your chicken and then you come back to get it later after they've slaughtered it and given it to you.
Right.
You go to a store, it's already there, either the whole chicken frozen or the chicken breast in the chicken breast section of your food market.
Right. Yeah. And people used to go to market too, and they would buy like little pigs and
little piggy went to the market.
Exactly.
Yep, that's right.
That's where the phrase "let the cat out of the bag" came from. Are you familiar with that?
We talked about those.
I've read about it. It's been a while though, so yeah.
Yeah, they would go and buy piglets, but instead of putting a pig in, like somebody would buy 2 or 3 pigs, they'd put a kitten in with it. And then when they got home and opened up the bag, it was letting the cat out of the bag. Oh, there was the secret. You've told the secret.
Right, because there's a cat there instead of a pig.
Exactly.
Yeah. So now we're going to come up to how Americans shopped for groceries and how it changed early part of the 20th century. Because if anybody's ever watched like Little House on the Prairie, and the Olsons had their market, Mrs. Ingalls would go in and go to the counter and tell Mrs. Olson, I need whatever, 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 whatever. And she would go get it and bring it and then she'd check out.
Right.
That's the way markets used to be. Okay. They were called counter stores, the old counter stores. They were being replaced by a new kind of store. The counter store, and I just described like Little House on the Prairie. Those stores did not typically offer any fresh produce or meat products. What they would be selling would be dried foods, canned foods, maybe preserved meats like salted pork, dehydrated foods. That's all they would sell. Now,
or if you were at the Olson's General Store, you were getting eggs because that's what Mrs. Ingalls would take in to sell.
Well, this is true. Yeah, because most of them didn't, but sometimes you could get small things like that. Right. Most of the time, your fresh produce and your fresh meat were being sold at other locations, but were close by where this counter store was. They were not all in the same store.
Right. Okay? Or you were growing it yourself.
Yes. Yeah. Or you had your own farm and you slaughtered your own pigs, your own cattle, or you milked your own cows. You had your own chickens. That was going on. Then we start to have the self-service grocery store that offered everything in one place. So it's one-stop shopping for your food. Okay. That started in 1916 with the Piggly Wiggly in Memphis, Tennessee. Clarence Saunders is the name of the man that started that. Now, there were other parts of the U.S. that were also experimenting with the self-service grocery stores, but this is the one that actually started it all and is the most popular. I mean, I don't know of anybody that has not heard of Piggly Wiggly.
Right. Yeah. Do you have a Piggly Wiggly near you?
I do.
Yeah, we've got one in, it's in Charleston. It's north.
Mm-hmm. I think the one near me might actually be in Kentucky because it's on the way to Franklin, Kentucky. So it might actually be across the state line. I'm not real sure. So not sure.
I don't know if there's Piggly Wigglies in Florida, but when we were on vacation in North Carolina recently, we drove by a grand opening of a Piggly Wiggly.
How about that?
Yeah.
Now, my
How about
youngest
that?
daughter lives in Mississippi. I think that's where they primarily do their grocery shopping if they're not at Walmart, and they call it, her husband says, I'm going to the pig. That's what they call the store, is the pig.
Pig. Now, this is an interesting bit of trivia because when I got information on the first self-service grocery stores, it come up and it said had a name on the top of it. I'm like, that's a weird name. And but what it was is that when these stores first started coming out, they were called groceterias.
Groceterias. Okay.
Groceterias.
Like a
Because they
cafeteria.
yes, they
But a
resembled the cafeteria type of eatery that was growing in popularity at the time. So they called them groceterias. So when I first got the first website I looked at for this, it said groceterias. And I'm like, what is that? But trivia there. Now, Piggly Wiggly first. Piggly Wiggly introduced
Yeah.
self-service grocery shopping, and it revolutionized the grocery industry. Many of the conveniences that we have today and we still use today started at the Piggly Wiggly in Memphis, Tennessee in 1960. They include checkout stands with people standing there to check you out. Price mark every item in the store. Now, granted, now it's not on the product, it's underneath the product.
Yeah.
But when Karen and I were kids, it had a little sticker on it that told you how much it was.
Yep.
Shoppers would get more food. They would get more for their dollar when they shopped at it because the Piggly Wiggly would buy things in larger volume so he could sell them cheaper.
Right.
So their dollar went a lot further, the Piggly Wiggly store.
Right. That's how come a lot of mom and pop stores are going out of business now when a Walmart moves in.
Right, because they cannot buy at such a large volume because everybody knows when you buy at a larger volume, you get it. You may pay more out of pocket right now, but you're paying less per volume.
Right.
So you're actually paying less in the long run. And if you're reselling it, you can sell it for less. So that's what Piggly Wiggly was doing. It featured a full line of nationally advertised brands. They use refrigerated cases to keep fresh produce.
Oh, wow.
Yes. They put employees in uniforms. It gave a cleaner and more sanitary food handling. Design and use of patented fixtures and equipment throughout the store. And they let people franchise the store. Mm-hmm. So independent grocers would be allowed to operate in different parts of the state and even in different states. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about electricity because you can't have those refrigerators or those refrigerated units in Piggly Wiggly without electricity. Now, electricity started its advance into U.S. homes in 1882. The Edison Electric Illuminating Company is what started it in New York. Now, most homes at that time still used either gas or candles to light their homes. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until 1925 that about half of the U.S. homes had electricity. And in great part to FDR's Rural Electrification Act of 1936, by 1945, 85% of American homes were powered by electricity, with virtually all homes having electricity by 1960.
Wow.
Now, initially, the electricity was used primarily for lighting, but as appliances like vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, and washing machines became more popular, they started becoming really popular in the 1950s. The demand for electricity grew and grew.
Mm-hmm. So you'll notice that too. If you go and you buy an older home, a home that's like 100 years old, you won't have as many outlets mm-hmm. as you will in a modern built home.
Yeah. Yes, true. Mm-hmm.
They just didn't have as many things to plug in.
No, they didn't. They weren't like we are now. No, not at all. Just a little FYI here is that in the 1920s, Americans simply ate a light breakfast of like coffee, maybe some orange juice, and some type of bread, like a roll or a pastry or something. In order to increase bacon sales, Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, wrote to 5,000 physicians asking whether a heavy breakfast was better for health than a light breakfast. 4,500 physicians wrote back confirming that a heavy breakfast was better for health as the body is depleted of nutrients after a night's sleep. He had the study published in the newspapers across the United States. conveniently presenting bacon and eggs as the ideal choice. This was all done for the Beech Nut Packing Company and a marketing campaign to sell more bacon.
Is that the first outreach of a food company to a physician?
I have no idea. I didn't look into that. I just, when I came across what people were eating then, I came up with that because Americans have not always ate bacon and eggs for breakfast. I mean, back in the olden days, we already talked about it. If you had leftovers the night before, that's what you had for breakfast.
Right.
And in other nations, bacon and eggs is not a common thing for breakfast in a lot of other nations. I mean, Asians will have fish and rice and things like that. It's not, it's an American thing.
Right.
And it happened because of that.
So he took their
Also,
opinions and labeled it a study. That's interesting.
Huh? Yeah, he labeled it a study, but it wasn't a study. He just sent a letter out to physicians. What's your opinion? This is my opinion. Okay, so there you go.
So it was more of a survey than a study.
Yeah.
Yes. And it was propaganda. It was not fact.
Right.
So now the Kellogg's Rice Krispies were invented in Battle Creek, Michigan in the mid 1920s by William Keith Kellogg. They were released to the public in 1928, just to give somebody an example of what kind of processing of foods have started by this time.
Have you seen the Instagram and TikTok videos of people making their own Rice Krispies?
No. Mm-mm. It says here, what the information I got said the cereal is made from partially dried grains that are shaped and then dried again until they expand and become crisp when heated. The cereal became popular for its distinctive crackling sound when milk is added.
Yeah.
The words snap, crackle, pop first appeared on a box of Rice Krispies in 1932.
Yeah. And
wow.
And now that's what my body sounds like when I get up in the morning.
When you're a kid, you hear snap, crackle, and pop in your cereal. When you're old, you hear it from your body.
Yes.
Your body.
So now we're going to move into the Great Depression. Grocery stores have started, and we got electricity going to homes, and we got refrigerators. And from what I found out, the first electric refrigerators did not have freezers in them. And when they did get freezers, it was just a little compartment for an ice tray. It wasn't until later that they got an actual freezer.
Do you remember Mama's old refrigerator? That she had, it was one big door on the front, and you opened it up, and it had another door on the inside.
That was the freezer.
That was the freezer. And there was a drawer right underneath. You remember the drawer? And she would put the soda.
She put soda in there.
Yeah. And then you would open it up, and it would be a slushy.
Yeah.
So
I remember that.
grandmother invented the slushy before there was the slushy.
Yes. She also invented liquid soap, our mom said.
Yes, she did.
The Great Depression was from 1929 to 1939. Now, times were so tough for a lot of Americans that some resorted to eating insects. And then I thought, no, wait a minute. Didn't John the Baptist eat locusts?
Locusts.
And honey? And honey, right?
Yeah.
So maybe that wasn't so bad, depending on what kind of insect they were eating.
I think if you read through Leviticus, you'll find that Moses had a list of insects that were considered clean.
Yes.
That you could eat, but I might be misremembering because it has been a number of years since I forced myself to read that book.
Yeah. Some of them in the Old Testament are like, oh.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I get it. Love God, love that he gave us his word, but it's boring, Lord. It's boring.
Okay, so where are we? I'm sorry, I got
we're eating insects. And of course, Americans would stand in line for soup and old bread. So soup and old bread are things that they ate. And many Americans went back to eating wild animals, including pheasants, squirrels, rabbits, and even skunks. You can imagine that?
No.
Well, now I know that the Life Below Zero that I watch on Nat Geo, they will eat porcupines.
Yeah, now I have seen people eat porcupine.
And I thought, oh, really? But they eat them, and they say they're very good, and they've got a lot of fat on them. So during the winter months, it's something that they really need.
Right.
So they go back to eating wild animals. They're eating even skunks. And then in areas where where fishing could be done, people are fishing for their food. Wild berries and apples and other edible vegetation are either grown or harvested or collected from the forests and the woods. Families either started or expanded any gardens that they had, and they canned a lot of produce for storing.
Yeah.
Um, if they had chickens, they were feeding themselves basically, like they had before all of these inventions started happening. They were going back to eating from the land.
Mm-hmm.
So they went back to basically eating regional, seasonal. Now, an example of a Depression era breakfast might have been a piece of seasonal fruit, maybe some milk and cereal. Or if you had chickens, eggs and toast with butter, if you happen to have bread and you happen to have butter. If all you had were the eggs, because you had the chickens, that's all you had was the eggs. A noon meal might have been maybe a sandwich with some sort of vegetables. You might have had some kind of soup that you would have made from what was there at the time or what that you had canned.
Mm-hmm.
Dinner would be some type of meat or like fish or fowl and some type of vegetables. And then if you were really lucky, you would get something sweet. And of course, that varied by households and areas where people live. It varied by quantity and quality. But that might have been a typical meal for someone during the Depression era.
Mm-hmm.
Now, many recipes were available to help families with preparing foods during this era. They were available. One way was via radio shows like The Mystery Chef, and in 1931, I think, might have been when that started. For people who happened to have a working radio that could afford it and could afford electricity, those people would get the recipes from the radio, and they would share them with the people that didn't have the radio or the electricity. They were also available by newspapers or free corporate-sponsored pamphlets. They were designed to help people prepare food, to get it to stretch out the limited supplies, and to use like spices and things like that to make it more tasty.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got a recipe for potted red cabbage.
Potted red cabbage?
Yeah, I've got a website for it, sandychatter.wordpress.com. Unraveling the mystery of the mystery chef. And one of the recipes on the website is potted red cabbage. It includes 1 red cabbage, 2 tablespoons of bacon fat or drippings, 1 medium-sized onion, 2 green apples, 1 tablespoon of lemon juice, 1 tablespoon of sugar, salt, and pepper.
Sounds good.
It does sound good.
Yeah, provided you actually have all of this.
Right.
You know, I noticed about the other recipes we looked at with cabbage, they also added apple.
Apple and cabbage together.
Why did we stop doing that?
It's good together. I've had it before.
Because they're natural foods. They're not processed.
Well, no, I'm just saying that anytime I've had a cabbage, it usually does not have fruit in it. And the first time I had a cabbage with a fruit in it, it was pineapple, and it was at a restaurant called Sweet Tomatoes.
It's actually pretty good to eat together.
It had pineapple. It was very good.
Now, there are foods that are still common among people today that debuted during the Great Depression. Wonder Bread, 1930. Bisquick, 1931. Miracle Whip, 1933. Campbell's Cream of Mushroom Soup, 1934. Ragu Spaghetti Sauce, Kraft Mac and Cheese, and Hormel Spam all appeared during the Roosevelt recession of 1937. Although I do have information that says Spam started during World War II, but we're working really, really close to when World War II is going to be happening because this is 1937.
Yeah.
Right.
So we're really close to that. The Great Depression also made people choose foods more wisely. They put more concern on the nutritional value of the food they ate so they could get more for their bodies for the meals that they were able to get. So they paid more close attention to what they were eating.
Yeah.
Twinkies, 1930. Frito corn chips, 1932. Ritz crackers, 1934. Lay's potato chips, 1939. They all came from the Great Depression. They were basically set up to be impulse buys at these self-service grocery stores because now people could steal food So they had to make up for that loss, and they made up for it with these impulse buys.
Wow.
Now, the original Twinkie recipe, concocted in 1930, included basic ingredients like eggs, milk, and butter. The need for a longer shelf life led to the introduction of additional ingredients, like all the artificial stuff.
Well, maybe we'll do a completely
Recipe,
separate episode as to whether or not a Twinkie will actually live for 100 years.
right? Now, the recipe for Frito corn chips hasn't changed much, if at all, from the beginning. The ingredients on a bag of the regular Frito corn chips, not the flavored ones, is corn, oil for frying, and salt. That's all that's in it. There's no artificial flavors or colors. They do like to use vegetable oil, corn, and or canola for the frying, which is not the healthiest choice, but there's no artificial colors or flavorings in that, nor is there in the Frito chips or the Lace chips. And I've got information on all that stuff. And I've got other places to get Depression era recipes. I'll share that with you, Karen.
Yeah, there's a lady that I follow on YouTube. Well, I think she's deceased now, but somebody was recording her before she passed away because of the way that she cooked. And she did something called Depression era cooking, where she makes recipes that would be like cut up hot dog, the weenies, and potatoes and onions all cooked together.
I think one of the websites I have here has Depression era recipe with like spaghetti noodles and like hot dogs in it, and spaghetti noodles with carrots in it.
Yeah, it's pretty much you ate what you had.
Yeah.
Yeah, no running to the store. Oh my gosh, I forgot to get spaghetti sauce. Run down to the store and get spaghetti sauce. There was none of that was happening.
No, not at all. Now, we were talking about refrigeration before, and one thing I didn't mention, I'm going to mention it now, is because of the time when it happened, is initially the refrigerated truck was used to keep ice cream cold.
Ice cream?
In 1925. Yep. In 1925, it was invented by Frederick McKinley Jones. The vehicles would be used, they would eventually be used for shipments of other food products, including fresh produce and meats. By 1939, the refrigerated trucks were further advanced with the development of automated cooling systems for shipping trailers. With about 4 million refrigerated vehicles worldwide, the trucks and trailers are indispensable in maintaining the so-called cold chain. That's crucial for the global economy and food.
Right.
So you need to be grateful for your truckers.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Yep.
We wouldn't be able to eat if it weren't for them. Okay, before you get into World War II, Shalon's got information on the FDA.
Okay, sounds good.
So our current FDA was actually part of the USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, until the 1900s, when it started off as just one single chemist and has now jumped to over 15,000 employees. And what was the budget? Wait,
4 billion.
oh, hold on, it wasn't on that page. $4.4 billion budget in 2014. And now, not only they employ chemists, pharmacologicalists, physicians, microbiologists, veterinarians, pharmacists, lawyers, which I thought was very interesting. And I did not know.
Yeah.
So, the FDA was established to help keep our food safe, because people would come in and try to take advantage of very trusting people. One thing that kind of hit me because I'm a mother was in 1912, they enacted what was called the Shirley, Sherley Amendment, which prohibits labeling medicines with false therapeutic claims intended to defraud the purchaser.
So no more snake oil salesmen.
Exactly. And the example that they have listed on the website that I have, which I'll send to Karen to include in the notes.
Yep.
states that Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for teething and colicky babies was laced with morphine and ended up killing many infants because of that.
Wow.
Scary.
Very.
Yeah.
Now, while
Yeah.
I don't like the government being so involved in our food, I appreciate that portion of it.
Right. Well, this is the drug portion of it, right?
Well, yeah, it is. Yeah.
But we consume medications, so
True.
Yes.
I guess that's how they're looking at it. It's something we consume,
Right.
so putting them in the same department.
Yes. The FDA got its name FDA in the 1930s. And I was just looking through on the website of the FDA milestones, and we were in the 30s, so in the Depression era just now. So in 1930, McNary-Mapes Amendment authorized the FDA for a quality and fill of container canned foods, excluding meat and milk products. The name Food, Drug, and Insecticide Administration was shortened to the FDA at that time as well.
It's kind of weird that food, drugs, and insecticides.
But when
people were eating bugs, so
we're spraying insecticides on our food.
On our food, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's what it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
1939, the first food standards issued were on canned tomatoes, tomato puree, and tomato paste.
Interesting.
How about that? I like to use those when I'm making chili. In 1934, retailers are introduced to a new version of the low temperature display case and leasing agreements. But in the midst of the Depression, the retailers could not afford that stuff. So Bird's Eye, we've all heard of Bird's Eye.
Yeah.
Commissioned American Radiator Corporation to design an inexpensive case, which Bird's Eye then leased to retailers for $7.50 a month or $10 for a larger model. In 1936, frozen orange juice concentrate is introduced by California Consumer Corporation, but insufficient packaging prevents this product from making it a real impact until about 10 years later. In 1937, Lord J. Harness, Harris, Harris, I guess, Lord J. Harris.
Harris, yeah.
Test marketed frozen pies, later introducing them to a handful of outlets, including Marshall Field's department stores in 1939. In 1938, Bird's Eye is selling most of its product to institutional customers like steam lines and railroad dining services, and there are restaurants that oppose the frozen foods, and they even have a notice on their menus that say they don't use frozen foods, so they're not liking the frozen foods. In the late 1930s, Bob White Frosted Foods Corporation developed a frozen foods home delivery program, but when World War II started and subsequent gasoline rationing, it put brakes on the company's home deliveries. So that leads us into World War II. Started September 1, 1939, went to September 2, 1945. The U.S. entered the war December 7, 1941. The day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war on Japan, which passed with only one dissenting vote. 3 days later, Germany and Italy, who were allied with Japan, declared war on the United States, and the United States says, all right, we're at war with all of you then. So that's how it all happened, and that was in 1941. Now, the United States involvement in World War II, it helped pull the country out of the Depression, because we're just ending the Depression in 1939, and we're going to war in 1941. This is what helped pull the U.S. out of that Depression.
Right, and this is a lot of this is a time too, right, when women started getting into the workforce because the men were gone fighting the war.
Yep. That's one of the things that happened. That's one thing that changed us. So it helped pull us out of the Great Depression. It created millions of jobs in defense and war industries, and it drafted the young men into military service. So it put a lot of people to work, either by working on stuff for the war or going to war. The war production effort led to a boom in production and almost immediately lowered the unemployment rate from around 25% to around 10%.
Wow.
Almost immediately, that fast. The need for labor also opened up new opportunities for women and minorities because minorities were not getting the same jobs as those white men.
Yep.
So women and minorities started stepping in and taking care of the stuff here at the home front while the fighters were overseas. The government began rationing certain foods in May 1942, starting with sugar. Coffee was added to the list that November, followed by meat, fats, canned fish, cheese, canned milk the following March.
Mm-hmm.
So, but during this time, the newspapers, home economics classes, and government organizations offered all sorts of tips to help families stretch their ration points and have as much variety in their meals as possible. Ration points were given to households. Soon, other items were rationed, including processed foods such as canned, jarred, dried, frozen, and bottled products. The meat and fish items and dairy items, everything was being rationed. 2 ration books were distributed to every quote. I'm quoting. 2 ration books were distributed to every single man, woman, child, and baby in the United States.
Wow.
One contained blue coupons for processed food, while the other contained red coupons for meat, fish, and dairy products. Each person started. Oh, it's thundering. Sorry.
That's okay. I can't
Each
hear
person
it.
started with 48 blue points. Can you hear it?
Uh-uh.
Okay. It was pretty loud. One coupon. Okay, where did it leave off? Each person started with 48 blue points and 64 red points each month. Thus, and I'm still quoting because I don't speak that way. Yeah, thus, I don't speak that way. The shopper for a family of 4 had a total of 192 points for processed food, 254 points for meats, fish, and dairy products. Each month brought new ration stamps as the old ones expired. Each stamp had a number on it designating the points it was worth, and a letter showing each ration period the stamp could be used for. Each ration product had a point value that was independent of the price.
So you couldn't bank your stamps?
No.
Wow.
Expired. Fresh produce was not rationed in the United States during World War II, but it would still be in short supply. So households who didn't already have a garden started one, and gardens were even encouraged and would be known as victory gardens.
Mm-hmm.
Some popular foods that we still eat today that were introduced during World War II in response to the shortages and changing food needs of the U.S. They included Cheerios, M&Ms, corn dogs, Spam. We were talking about Spam a little bit. Rice Krispie treats, Townhouse crackers. They began their signature light buttery oval crackers on October 4, 1940. So it was a little bit before World War II, but during that time frame.
I prefer Townhouse over Ritz, but
I do too, but I like Ritz too.
yeah.
Now the M&Ms, as we know, was invented to provide chocolate to the American troops that would not melt.
Melts in your mouth, not in your hand.
Right. They put the candy coating over it it wouldn't melt. It wouldn't melt in shipping. And they let me find where it says it. The candies were originally sold in cardboard tubes and came in a variety of colors, including brown, red, orange, yellow, green, and violet. The refrigerated trucks that were invented in 1925 by Frederick McKinley Jones and put to good commercial use in 1939 after the development of automated cooling systems for shipping trailers were used during World War II for shipping blood plasma and medication to soldiers.
Wow.
Frozen foods that were already in America, they started in 1929. During World War II, frozen foods became more popular because they were more affordable than canned goods, and required fewer ration points. And it also, because women began to work outside of the house, it gave them a much easier and faster way to prepare meals.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I've got so far for that.
So when was the first TV dinner? Is that what you were just talking about?
Frozen foods. There were frozen meals, so it it's going to graduate into the frozen foods we know today. But this is like the very beginning of it. And of course, they were not real popular at the time, like because first of all, not everybody had a freezer in the refrigerator,
Right.
and then so you're going to have to get the refrigerator development to where all refrigerators in all homes have a freezer in it, not just a little compartment for ice, but an actual freezer in order for them to keep frozen foods.
Right.
But of course, the families that did have the refrigerators with a freezer big enough for frozen foods, they would eat them. They got more food for their ration points and for the women who were working building those airplanes.
Well, I
They
just
had a
had
meal ready
this.
for them when they got home.
Yeah. I just had this thought, like, when did the first ice cream truck, when was that used? So a guy by the name of
That,
Harry Burt in
Mhm.
Youngstown, Ohio, is credited with inventing the first ice cream truck in 1920.
Okay.
And he's also the one that invented ice cream on a stick.
So you're talking about the ice cream truck that all the kids run to get their ice
Yes.
cream cone?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we talked about the refrigerated trucks. They were first done to keep ice cream cold.
Yeah. Then this guy just took the next step.
Mm-hmm.
So I just thought that was interesting. And then I looked
Interesting.
it up. The first TV dinner was introduced in 1953 by Swanson
Right. Well,
Sons.
the frozen foods that we have now are not going to be exactly like they are now, right? They're just not going to be, because back in these days they didn't have all of that artificial flavoring and coloring, and
Well, I'm talking about like a
foods
TV
didn't have
dinner,
all that.
like the ZZ Top song, where you've got your Salisbury steak and your mashed potatoes
Yeah,
and
yeah,
what was it that used to come with it? Was it like apples or something? An
something
apple
like that, some type of
crisp
dessert.
brownie.
Brownie or cinnamon apple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, this says
those
in
those
an aluminum
those started getting
tray.
real popular in the 1950s. It was after World War II, because after World War II and the men came home, people lost interest in those frozen foods. But they started becoming popular again in the 1950s. And since I only went to World War II,
Mm.
you know, I didn't get into the 1950s yet. That's next time. I've got some copycat recipes for Twinkie and Ritz crackers.
Oh, I'll take the one for Twinkies.
Yeah, what's it say? Karen and I'll do it on the Instagram this week. Oh,
It has 2 cups of flour, 1.5 cups of sugar, 1 tablespoon of baking powder, half a teaspoon of salt, half a cup of vegetable oils, 3/4 cup of cold water, 2 teaspoons of vanilla, 7 egg yolks, 7 egg whites, half teaspoon of cream of tartar. For the filling, it's
I have
six
to beat
tablespoons of flour, rounded,
the white separately.
1.5 cups of butter, flavor Crisco, 1.5 cups of sugar, 1 cup of cold milk, scant, so not a complete cup, just a little under a cup, and 2 teaspoons of vanilla. That's what it includes. So I'll put it on there if y'all want to make it. That's cool. I guess you don't have to put it in a thing like a cupcake. You can if you want, I guess.
I think I've got a silicone pan. Are they called pans if it's made out of silicone? I don't know.
silicone baking dish.
Yeah. That is actually, it's made for making hot dog buns, but I bet we could make a Twinkie
Yeah.
in that.
You know what I thought
Yeah.
of was the cast iron skillet that mother had that had the
Corn? I think I might have one of those.
That's what I thought of. I'm like, tubular.
Have a
Corn-shaped Twinkie.
shaped Twinkie.
Why not? Okay.
What are we talking about next week?
Well, if we're continuing with our current subject, we're going to look at the 1950s and move forward from there. So the 1980s, I think, needs its own little thing, because that's when the ultra processed foods start coming in.
Okay, so we'll do
50,
the
60, 70.
1980s was Cold War as well.
Well,
Yeah.
So we'll
Yeah.
do like 1950s up through the 1970s.
Yeah.
Okay. And then we'll split our assignment in our chat.
Okay. Okay.
So we will see and talk to everybody next time when we continue with food in America and the history of it and where it's going to end up. As if you don't already know.
You're eating it for dinner tonight, so you know.
You're right. All right. Dee Dee, we'll talk to you later.
Okay.
Bye.
Love you.
Love you.
Thanks for joining us on Sister Sharpens Sister. We certainly appreciate you. And if you could, like, comment, subscribe, share, hit the notification bell. We'll talk to you next week.